Word Balloon is brought to you by the League of Word Balloon listeners, my producers, if you will, because they give me the funds to keep Word Balloon going via Patreon at patreon.com. If you like the show and want to help out, it would be greatly appreciated. I'm not asking you to break the bank. Can you spare the price of a comic book a month? Even $1 a month would really help me out and keep things going. You know, I've expanded Word Balloon the last couple years to be an almost daily podcast and provide a really great look into pop culture. And that is because I get great help from the League of Word Balloon listeners. Again, if you could help out, it would be greatly appreciated. Patreon.com/wordballoon. Thank you very much for your great support, the League of Word Balloon listeners. Now available to order at your local comic shop, it's Sal Abenante's new graphic novel, The Hostage.
Hostage is set in the streets of Rio de Janeiro, based on the plight of the street children that live in the favelas. In the world of the graphic novel, being murdered daily, and the hostage is the evil spirit that is raised to avenge their death. Origins go all the way back to the indigenous tribes of the Amazon as the spirits that protect children, especially murdered children. The level of death that these kids have to endure every day. They have nowhere to sleep. They have no place to eat. They have to survive off of begging. There were nobody in capes that were coming to save these kids.
Pick up Sal Abenante's latest graphic novel, The Hostage. Order now at your local comic shop through Diamond's Previews catalog. Code DEC221534.
Welcome back to Word Balloon, the comic book conversation show. This is John Suntrus. Today, a conversation with legendary writer Gerry Conway. Gerry made his mark at DC and Marvel early in his career, working on both companies' biggest icons, significant runs on Superman and Spider-Man in particular, including their first team-up in that deluxe Treasury edition of the 1970s with artist Ross Andru. We'll be talking about his pair-ups with Ross and other classic Marvel artists, including John Romita, Gil Kane, and talk about some of the big moments in the Marvel and DC universe that Gerry was responsible for, like the birth of the Punisher and the death of Gwen Stacy. Gerry spent a good portion of the 90s and early 2000s writing for the TV series Law & Order, but he's back to comics, working for DC, looking at Buddy Baker, Animal Man, 25 years down the line in his career, and suddenly finding his powers are fading. It's The Last Days of Animal Man, a 6-issue miniseries from DC Comics, with art from Chris Batista. This episode of Word Balloon is brought to you by the comic book podcast companion From Tomorrows, a great book that was just written by Eric Houston. Here's the description of the book at the Tomorrows website. Comic book podcasts have taken the internet by storm, and now Tomorrows is offering you the chance to go behind the scenes of 10 of today's top comic book podcasts with new interviews from the casts of Around Comics, Quiet Panelologists at Work, Comic Book Queers, iFanboy, the Crankcast featuring Mike Norton and Chris Crank, the Collected Comics Library and TuneIn podcast hosted by Chris Marshall, Augie DeBleek's Pipeline podcast, Comic Geek Speak, and me, Word Balloon. Good chapter, actually, on Word Balloon. He also has interviews with comic creators Matt Fraction, Tim Seeley, and Gene Colan. You'll also find a guide of what you need to start your own podcast, an index of more than 30 great comic book podcasts, numerous photos of your favorite podcasters. I would look away from those photos. And original art from Gene Colan, Tim Seeley, and Mike Norton, with a spectacular new cover by Mike Manley. The book retails for $15.95 at the Tomorrows website. You can pick it up for $13.56 if you go to tomorrows.com. And a digital version of the book is also available separately for $9.95. It's the comic book podcast companion from Tomorrows. The conversation with Gerry begins with a look at his return to the comic book scene.
I have to ask, and I know you've covered this in some written interviews that you've done. What brought you back to comics? Because, as you say, you've had a wonderfully successful career in television and film, and particularly in television, Law and Order. You're one of their go-to guys, and were for so many years. Why back to comics?
Well, for a variety of reasons. I think primarily the difference between working in film and television and working in comics, at least at the level that I can work, is in film and television, you're constrained by the financial imperatives of the medium. This is a very high-risk medium where, for an average episode, for example, of a show like Law and Order, you're talking about a budget of $2.5 million
Wow.
for an episode. That's a big risk.
Yeah.
So the amount of supervision, interference, oversight that you're going to experience, even if you're a respected writer, is going to be tremendous. By contrast, the financial investment in a issue of a comic book is relatively minor. So if you're someone who is, I think well thought of, or has a track record, you're more likely to be allowed a certain amount of independence in your writing than you would be in film and television. So, as someone who's worked in the television and film world for about 20 years, and accomplished a fair amount, I also banged my head against that wall, that creative wall, more than a few times, and found it to be kind of frustrating, and certainly in comparison to the amount of freedom that I would have writing comics. So about a couple of years ago, I pretty much hung up my shingle, where I actually took my shingle down, let's put it that way, as a television writer, and turned away from that particular part of my career, and have been sort of casting around trying to decide what it was that I'd like to do for an encore, and returning to comics where I have a certain amount of history and a fan base and an interest that I have just for it as a medium. Seemed like a kind of a natural move.
I know a lot of current writers that will cite, there are the obvious stories like the death of Gwen Stacy that, they'll cite as classic. And I know there's a great contingent of current writers like Brad Meltzer and Jeff Johns who are a big fan of JLA Detroit, one of your babies. Yeah. And
yeah,
so
I'm always amazed by that. There it is. Given the amount, what's funny is that the things that you get criticized for or that you get a lot of flack for at the time often end up being what you're best remembered for fondly, by people years later, which is really amazing to me.
Sure.
And kind of counterintuitive. It's like you'd expect that the work that gets you praise and respect at the time, would be what you would be remembered and respected for later, but often that's not the case.
Well, let's talk about this current story, The Last Days of Animal Man.
Yes.
I go back to some printed interviews that I've read of yours, and I think it's interesting and wonder if, as you return to comic books, as a writer, do these initial stories come to you in the form of a premise versus a specific character? Tell me, because I think I had read that maybe you started with a different hero in mind for this story, and then found a good fit as well with Buddy Baker, Animal Man.
Well, actually, what happened in this case was that I came up with the premise, the notion. I was playing around in my mind. What stories do I want to tell?
Mm-hmm.
When I was, a young man, when I was in my late teens and early 20s, and writing books like Spider-Man, I was writing about myself. I was writing Peter Parker at the same age. I was the same age that he was as a character, so I could relate to his experiences. But today, I wouldn't necessarily think that I'd be able to immediately relate to Peter Parker's issues. But I could relate to the idea of someone, looking at his life from the viewpoint of a major change in his ability to accomplish the things that he used to be able to accomplish. In other words, like a midlife crisis, which is a natural part of growing older. And I thought, what's the metaphor for that in terms of a superhero? Well, in terms of a superhero, it's a character who is going through the crisis of losing his powers. And not losing them because, he's been exposed to red kryptonite or because he's been attacked by a villain, who's, got some machinations against him, but, just as a natural part of life, this happens. And what would you do, if you're this character? Well, I didn't have a specific character in mind, primarily because the way that the comic book business is run these days, all of these characters have ongoing, and rather complicated storylines that are interwoven with each other. So for me to come in and say, hey, how about we do a story where Aquaman, suddenly can't breathe underwater anymore, is not a practical suggestion.
Okay.
So I came to Joey Cavalieri, who had been asking me if I had any notions for a story, and I said, this is the basic idea. Do you have a character that you think this would fit? Does DC have someone that they think would, be a suitable protagonist for this? And they came back with the idea of let's do it with Animal Man. Let's set it, in the future so that we don't have to worry about continuity. And it really worked. I thought, this is a guy who's an everyman type of character. Father, husband, an ordinary guy in his real world life. It would make a really good fit for this particular premise.
He is definitely one of those everyman heroes, and I know that a lot of the successful writers with him have portrayed him as such. As someone who came back to comics, and I know that you did a lot of research on Buddy, what did you think of some of the runs like Grant Morrison's run and some of the stories that have been told already about Animal Man?
Well, I think you've got there. To my mind, there's two separate existences for Animal Man. There's the existence in which he's part of the regular DC universe, and then there's the existence in which he was a character in a Grant Morrison series at Vertigo.
Mm-hmm.
And there's some overlap in that these are both the same guy, but the Grant Morrison stories are not so much about Buddy Baker as they are about comic books. They're a deconstruction of comic book storytelling, not really driven by an internal set of issues that Buddy Baker is going through. They're more driven by interests that Grant Morrison, as a writer, is bringing to it. So, to me, Grant's stories, while I have to reference the internal material that occurs in those stories, are not really relevant to the story that I'm telling, because he was telling a different kind of comic book story.
Okay.
He was telling a story about comic book stories.
Sure. No, you're absolutely right.
Right. It's just not, that's not what I'm doing. I'm telling a story about Buddy Baker, a guy in his late 40s, early 50s, who's experiencing a natural change as a human being.
I think it's interesting that you've hit the ground running, creating a couple villains right away. We've only seen one right now. As we're recording this, issue 1's the only one that's been out. I understand there's a second one coming. But as you say, it seems middle age is really the villain in this story.
Well, I found this to be true when I came back to writing Spider-Man in the late 80s. I don't know whether this frustrated my editor or not, but I had, at that point, for whatever reason, I had lost, not interest, but I'd lost a certain amount of passion for the superhero part of the story, and I was more interested in what was going on for Peter Parker and Mary Jane and the cast of characters that surrounded him in his personal life as opposed to a superhero life. So I did a extended storyline that featured those characters, and almost, I won't say as an afterthought, but it sort of flipped around the format that Stan had created, which was to do a superhero story with overtones of personal life stories filtered through it. And what I did was a story about Peter Parker with overtones of superhero stories filtered through that. And in the same sort of way, you can't do, I mean, to be interesting to a reader of comics, since it's a graphic and visual media with a lot of possibilities for the action and the large scale visuals, you can't just do an internal story by focusing on the internal conflict. You need to somehow express it through a physical and dynamic conflict. Mm-hmm. And the characters that I created for him to battle, I won't say they're metaphors, but they certainly reflect aspects of the issue. For
sure.
him. You have Blood Rage, who is physicality personified, and is everything that Buddy isn't at this moment. A powerful physical entity that's driven purely by his need for additional power. And the second character that we're bringing in, which starts in the second issue, is this daughter of the illegitimate daughter of the second Mirror Master, and she's sort of emblematic of another aspect of what Buddy's going through, which is how his powers affect the people around him. How his being a superhero has had an effect on the people around him, because she's an example of someone who was destroyed. I mean, her life was destroyed by her father being a supervillain. So she has a very real, not a metaphoric sense, but again, sort of emblematic of the other issue that's going on for him. And I don't try to bang anybody over the head with this. Mostly what I do is I have Buddy being banged over the head by the villains. But it enables me to sort of do an externalization, of the internal drama.
Well, and his kids are so young in the current DC universe, and they haven't come into the story yet. But will we see them in this?
Yeah.
Okay,
yeah.
So clearly we're going to deal with, I guess...
we're going to see Maxine as a young adult and Cliff as a young adult. And we're going to see how they've been affected by having a father who lived the life that Buddy lived. I mean, it's not a story in which there are any... in which the main characters come off particularly well or particularly badly. I mean, they come off like people, I hope. With strengths and flaws. And Buddy, as both a hero and as a human being, has his strengths and his flaws, and how they affect the people in his life, is part of what that story is, and how Maxine and Cliff, growing up in that, have become the people that they've become, is also part of that.
That's great. I'm only about 10 or 12 years younger than you. I'm 44, and grew up reading the different stages of comic book writing in what was once, I think, books that were written for a 12-year-old audience. And feel free to correct me if I'm wrong. But
no, really, absolutely right.
You also were very active through the late 80s and early 90s, where we had the initial deconstructive period. And now I think today's more successful writers are able to tell these very personal human stories with, just as you say, using the action as not only a metaphor, but you've got to have something exciting to read, to look at while they're dealing with the internal conflict. But there have been a few writers that have been kind of knocked for what is called decompressed storytelling, and I wonder if you saw that same characteristic when you read a lot of today's books by the current younger writers.
Well, I think like in any large group of people, there's a variety, of approaches and talents. Mm-hmm. The best of the writers today, I think, do try to combine these things, and to do it seamlessly and to do it without, being obvious about it. We don't want, in a way, as being like magicians, we don't want you to know how we're doing the trick, right? So, okay, fair enough. A good writer doesn't want it to be so obvious, that this is what they're doing. I think people like Jeff Johns, Brad Metzer, Jeff Loeb, are all people who, get it, and bring that kind of balance, to their storytelling. In terms of people who are mostly interested in just doing the conversation or just doing the talk, the talking heads, I can empathize. I mean, I feel like that's something I was sort of into in the late '80s. Where, as I said, I sort of flipped it around and was doing stories about Peter Parker, in which the Spider-Man stories were, the secondary element.
Mm-hmm.
It's hard. I mean, it's hard. It's hard, I think, for some writers. To get past the boredom,
Sure.
with the standard material, and you either come back to it, and I'm very grateful that I've had this opportunity to come back to it, because I feel like I'm past the boredom. I mean, I was bored with this material at one point, just because I had done so much of it, and I knew how it worked. Now I come back to it and I'm like, oh, well, this is kind of fun. This is a fun way to break up a story, to make things happen, and to keep me interested. But I can sympathize, and empathize with writers who, just get tired of writing an action scene, and they're more interested in what's going on in that conversation, and they forget that you can do both. You can have a conversation in the middle of an action scene,
Sure.
and it can be fun. So it's just, and this is fine. I mean, the field is big enough now that you can do all these different kinds of things.
Tell me about working with your artists today as opposed to back in the 70s and 80s, and I know I was reading in particular a concentration of your JLA work, and I was going to ask you too what it was like to work with a guy like Dick Dillon, and was surprised to read that you really didn't have any personal contact with him. It was really through the editor, you submitting a script, and also the interesting thing that you said after a time you were able to figure out what his strengths were and the ability to write to those strengths. Is it more of a direct collaboration today for you?
Not on this particular job. I've never met Chris.
Okay.
And I've been writing my scripts in advance. I mean, I've done it in what we used to call DC style, but both companies now do it both ways. They do Marvel style and DC style, where they either break the story down and provide dialogue after the art, or write a full script in advance.
Mm-hmm.
And in this particular one, I've been writing a script in advance, and I just finished issue 4.
Okay.
And all I've really seen is issue 1. I haven't seen the pencils on any of the other issues. And I take it back. I saw half of the pencils on issue 2, but I haven't really seen in depth, the work. And honestly, I'm having fun with that. I mean, I like being surprised by what Chris is doing. I'm trying to be very consistent in my writing, so that I don't pull the rug out from under him by throwing something in later, and doing one of these. Oh, by the way, I forgot to mention that that in this particular location there's this device, that I didn't happen to mention 5 pages ago.
Okay.
So I'm trying to play fair with him and alert him to where I'm going as I'm writing the script. And that's something that I've learned from writing television and working with directors in television. Learning what they need to do their job, so that they can visualize the drama that I've put on the page.
You did obviously at the start say the differences between writing comics and writing for television. Is a full script, because a lot of people that listen to the show are curious about the craft of writing as well. So I'm curious, are your full scripts different from what they were 15 years ago or 20 years ago?
They are. I like to think that they're more thought out. I wrote by the seat of my pants back in the period that I was most prolific in comics. I was writing 5 to 6 titles a month.
Wow.
Full stories, and between 100 and 120 and 150 pages of comic books a month, which is an enormous amount of material.
Absolutely.
And, yeah, and out of that, I think I'd like to think that I wrote maybe, two-thirds of it was relatively good stuff. I mean, at least at the level that I wanted to be writing at. But the problem with it is that when you're writing that quickly, it's very hard to be reflective about what you're doing. You're sort of writing instinctively and from the gut, which is good, because when you're writing from the gut, you're writing what really matters to you, and you're tapping into your unconscious in a very productive way. But it's not being filtered. It's not being filtered by reflection or by the kind of insights that your conscious mind will bring to it. Or you'll say, oh, maybe I can foreshadow this a little bit better. If I can't foreshadow something if I don't know that I'm going to do it. This time around, writing Last Days, I know exactly where I'm going to end in this miniseries. I know what's happening in each issue before I come to it. I know what the structure of the story is going to be, and that enables me to set things up in ways that I didn't do before. So I'm happier with the results. I don't know whether it's a better result. I mean, that's a question that really you can't answer. But I know that it's a more crafted result. So in that sense, I think it's a more mature writing style.
Is it hard to transition from the 3-act television play to the 5-issue or 6-issue current comic book miniseries and story beats?
Not really, because both are based on classical structure. This is going to sound very pretentious, but there's really only one or two ways to structure a story. 3 acts is basically it. Actually, I will take it and extend it out to the 5-act structure that you have in Greek plays and in Shakespearean plays. And that, even in a 3-act structure, you're still doing the classical 5-act structure. You're just breaking it at different points.
Okay.
So a comic book story, a 6-part comic book story, actually works very well for the classical structure. Even though the classical structure is 5 parts, you can make it work fairly easily. Every story has a beginning, middle, and an end. Every story has an introduction, a crisis, a development of the crisis, a climax, a denouement, and an aftermath.
Sure,
that's basically it. And that's what you're doing with a comic book story. I actually knew that when I was writing before, so in a structural sense, my work hasn't changed that much.
Who were your early comic book influences that kind of helped shape your writing style?
In terms of story, I'd say Gardner Fox was a fairly influential writer. Gardner Fox and John Broome.
That's great.
Under Julie Schwartz, because they also worked in that kind of classical structure. They were what I took from them was their structure, not necessarily their language. In terms of the heart of the stories, I'd say it was Stan Lee, because Stan was the one who brought in the idea that stories should be about people, and what people are experiencing and what is happening to them on the inside, is reflected in what they're doing on the outside. And in terms of language, I'd say Roy Thomas was a very strong influence, and Denny O'Neil too, but less so. I mean, Denny. While I'm an admirer of Denny's work, I don't think I was ever influenced by it very much.
Okay.
I think that he and I sort of went on parallel tracks. I mean, he was influenced by some of the same things I was influenced by. So I consider he and I sort of are the same generation of writers, and Roy and Stan Gardner of the previous generation.
I found it interesting looking at some of the early stuff that you had a hand on creating, and in particular 3 horror titles, where it seemed you did the first book, and then the books were handed on to different people. And I'm thinking of Werewolf by Night, Man-Thing, and Tomb of Dracula.
Yeah, actually, in all 3 of those cases, it was a collaboration with Roy, too.
Okay.
Roy came up with the initial premises of all those books, and in some cases, I think he actually wrote a plot for the stories, and then I took them and developed it, internally and from a character point of view. So yeah, I mean, I think Werewolf by Night I was most connected with, of the 3 books. I wrote Werewolf, I think, for, I want to say like 10 or 11 issues, but I'm not sure. I was sort of the Johnny, the go-to guy, the Johnny of all trades for Marvel and for DC over the years, because I'm a fairly facile, and this is also true in television. It was true for me. I'm facile at adapting my style to other people's styles, and that's not necessarily a talent that I think highly of, but it is one that I have.
Okay.
So I was able to come in and do stories in the voice of other writers, or follow up for Roy, for example, on something that he wanted to initiate. I could take it and take it the next step, but usually there was always something else that they needed me to do, so I would move on to the next thing.
Well, you put such a stamp yourself on Spider-Man, and eventually I'm going to have to be the 100 millionth person probably to ask you about the death of Gwen Stacy. But before I do that, I'm very curious about the Punisher, and in particular, and again, this is probably something that you've been asked maybe 50,000 times as opposed to the death of Gwen Stacy. But the character that was it Mac Bolan, the Executioner?
Mac Bolan.
Yeah, and was that a character that was being thought of in the creation for the Punisher?
Well, there were several characters. I mean, I was actually talking with someone else about this today. The Punisher was a reflection of the time that he was created in. We had this kind of vigilante, iconic mentality going on. We had Death Wish and
you bet.
Dirty Harry and the Executioner, as you say, were all very popular characters. So he was a character that I didn't expect or intend to be a mainline villain. I considered him, when I first developed him for the story, he was supposed to be a secondary character to the Jackal, a one-shot knockoff character. And I thought, well, it'd be fun to do a take on this kind of vigilante character. But in the writing of it and in the art by Ross Andru, it became so interesting.
Absolutely.
It's like I could see that this guy had some potential beyond that, and the fan response was immediate. We immediately got people wanting to see more of him. So one thing led to another, and there he went.
Well, and you and Ross Andru were such an amazing team, and I should probably throw in Mike Esposito. I'm assuming he was the inker on that stuff. Am I wrong, or?
He was the inker on some of it, but we had John Romita inked some of it, and Frank Giacoia,
okay.
was an inker. I forget. I think I'm not sure that Mike did ink that much of the Spider-Man stuff, because I'd have to go back and look.
Okay.
I don't honestly remember.
Well, specifically you and Ross, then. I mean, that the wonderful Spider-Man Superman Treasury Edition book. I mean, that was just such a fun story. Were you able to work closer with Ross? I mean, when it was working Marvel style.
We worked very closely together.
Okay.
Ross and I, we had a very similar approach to story. And I found that I could have a conversation with Ross about where we would take the first third of a story, and say, in like 20 or 30 minutes, we would break that down, and he would go off and do the pencils, and then I would be able to write the material. and it was like we were thinking the same way.
Wow.
So it was a very pleasant experience. There were some some artists that I've worked with where, it was a battle, where we never saw things quite the same, and I was always disappointed, and they were always frustrated, and that kind of thing. But with Ross, it was always smooth. It was smooth sailing. He was, I think, one of the more underrated artists in comics. Somebody who should really be rediscovered. They talk about Marvel does these Marvel Visionary books, and I really think they should be doing, Ross Andru Marvel Visionary book.
I was pleased
I
to...
really did, to my mind, the definitive 1970s Spider-Man. Was as important to Spider-Man's development as John Romita was in the 60s and Steve Ditko in the early 60s. But that's my opinion.
Well, I know a lot of fans that would agree, and I was happy to see that they are starting to collect your guys' run. I was talking to Mike Norton, one of the DC artists, and he's a huge fan of Ross Andru, and when you guys were working together on Spider-Man, and he was even telling me, I told him I was going to talk to you, and he was like, I don't know why Marvel chose to do this at this time, but I'm glad they did. So maybe we'll see some more interest, and I hope I hope more of your guys' work together does get collected, because it's certainly the Spider-Man of my childhood, and it was exciting stuff, and man, you really benefited from some amazing artists in Spider-Man, and now I'm gonna of course ask you that obligatory Gwen Stacy moment, because man, I got to tell you, it is still such an incredible scene and sequence of panels, and just that tragic classic Spider-Man moment of the success and failure of attempting to save her. Would you mind telling me? I mean, going back to the idea of can we get Gwen Stacy? I mean, getting permission from Stan and taking us through that whole process.
Sure. Actually, at that point, I had been on the book for maybe a year. I'm not sure how long I'd been on. Issue 21, I came on around 113. So yeah, maybe about less than a year. And I'd been working with John Romita for most of that, and Romita was the dominant half of the partnership, as he should be, because he was a guy who had been around the character for many, many years and was really the go-to guy as far as the storytelling on Spider-Man. So a lot of the stories that he and I did together were stories where I would come up with the premise, and then John would basically develop the story and the plot based on that overall premise. He was playing around with the idea. He wanted to do a story where we would kill off a main character, because he felt that it had gotten to the point where things were, settled and safe and simple. And he, as a fan, I think he was telling me this recently, as a fan of Milt Caniff, the cartoonist who did Terry and the Pirates and Steve Canyon, he was saying that Caniff was a big proponent of the idea of shaking things up by killing off a main character now and then. And so John had pitched this to Stan and to me, and Stan said, sure. Stan at that point really wasn't paying attention to the material. He was building his empire, as the publisher at Marvel, expanding the books, working on trying to get us into different markets and so on. So he didn't really, and he trusted that we all knew what we were doing, so he had this kind of a hands-off attitude.
Okay.
And then as we were talking about it, we came to the conclusion, I don't know whether it was, Romita was pushing for the idea of killing off Aunt May, and I didn't think that was a good idea, because in my mind, Aunt May was a stabilizing force in Peter's life, a touchstone that, if you removed it, would leave this gaping hole. How do you fill that relationship? There's nobody else who can be that person to him. But in terms of his girlfriends, in terms of the women that were in his life, he had gone through, several by that point. He'd had Liz Allen and Betty Brant, and there was always a sense that none of these women were permanent, with the exception of Mary Jane. To my mind, when I was a reader, and I was reading the comics at the point when Mary Jane was first introduced, she brought something to the mix that I had not ever seen before. A very capable, very individual female character who did not need the hero. She didn't need him.
I hear you.
She didn't care that he was there. She liked him. She was potentially available, but she wasn't on the make for Peter Parker.
I hear you.
Gwen Stacy, on the other hand, was more of a traditional superhero love interest.
Mm-hmm.
She was not an independent person in and of herself. She existed primarily. You got the feeling that if Peter went out of the room, she disappeared. There was no there with Gwen Stacy. And I'm not, and there you go. But so I never cared. I never thought there was anything about her that made her compelling. She didn't bring anything to the dance, as far as I was concerned. So I said, well, what about Gwen Stacy? Let's just get rid of her. That way we can clear the way for the really interesting character, Mary Jane. And there was sort of like, well, yeah, okay, that makes sense. And nobody thought anything one way or the other about it as being a good idea or bad idea. They had basically cleaned house with her dad. Was gone. So she and Harry Osborn had a relationship, but Harry Osborn had gone nuts.
Right.
With becoming the Green Goblin. So it really wasn't. She didn't really serve any function other than as the girlfriend. So from a truly cold-hearted point of view, let's dump her and bring on the other girl. And that was it. We didn't think anything further of it. Now, in the telling of the story, it became much bigger. I think that because we felt like, okay, we're going to be killing off this character. Let's make it count. And that in the telling of it, it became much larger. It wasn't going to be just a building falls on her. It wasn't going to be, she does something heroic and saves the day. It was going to be the fulfillment of who she was. And if you come down to it, who she was, in my mind, her role was to be captured and held hostage. I mean, that's basically what she brought to the story.
The damsel in distress.
Yeah, she was the damsel in distress. Tie her to the railroad tracks. And my feeling was, well, what would be really interesting is if the train actually ran over her.
Wow. Yeah.
What? I mean, we're always saying, get to her before the train, and so on. Or what if you pull her away from the train and she gets run over by a truck? When you pull her away from the train. That was my perversity, which was the idea that the hero, and certainly the idea that Peter Parker as a hero, was that he was a defective hero.
Absolutely.
He was a guy who, on his best days, when he succeeded, there was failure within it. And to me, this was just an extension of that. Okay, he will rescue her, but in the rescuing, it will result in her death. And I liked, I was perverse enough to think that was, kind of cool. And I didn't think that it would have the kind of reaction that the fan press had to it, which was as if I had, I'd gone out and killed Dorothy's Toto. If I'd strangled Toto, and it was like, oh my God! And even at the time, I thought, who are they talking about? This girl was nobody. As I realized today there was a great quote from Macbeth that relates to this. Which is referring to a character that was killed in the story. Nothing became as life so much as the leaving of it. What makes Gwen Stacy an iconic character is the fact that she died.
Absolutely.
Period.
Yeah.
That's all she's got. somebody said to me, why is it that this is, of all the characters in comics who've been killed off, is she the only one who's never come back? I said, because she's only interesting because she's dead.
Hear, hear. And, well, whose idea was it to put the breaking of the neck? Because
that was I take full responsibility for that.
Well, and and I'm not asking if you don't want to say, that's okay, because much like Don McLean in American Pie, I'll let you keep whatever references are still mysterious to you, and you release them when you want to, or I guess like the identity of Deep Throat. But I mean, do you have a firm idea of the circumstance? Because what, as readers, we don't know is what killed Gwen Stacy.
Right.
Was it the fall?
Right.
Was it the grabbing of the web and the snapping of the neck? When did she die?
Well, here's the thing. As far as the characters inside the Marvel Universe are concerned, she died from the fall. The Green Goblin says that, to Peter, and Peter, I think, probably would have killed himself if he believed that he was responsible for what happened to her. So I think inside the Marvel Universe, while people might blame Spider-Man for her death, they don't actually consider him culpable of her death. He's blamed in the same way that George Bush is blamed for things that he's done.
I understand.
Which, you could say yes, he's responsible, but he didn't pull the trigger.
Sure.
In my view, that snick is probably what killed her.
Wow. You
see, now maybe not, but I only put the sound in there because when I saw the picture, and it was not my intention that he killed her, but when I saw the picture and you see the way that Gil drew her, with her body sort of flipping backwards and her head sort of swinging backwards, you get the full impression that at least Gil thought, that there was a kind of a whiplash thing going on there.
Absolutely.
So putting the sound effect in seemed like the natural thing to do.
Did you ever talk?
I think it was.
Go ahead.
No, I never spoke to Gil about it.
Oh, okay. And what were you going to say? You thought what?
Well, I think that on some level there was this kind of unconscious collaboration between the two of us. Unspoken, undiscussed. Here, do with this what you will. From Gil, and me going, okay. The two of us sort of like going, yeah, I think that's what happened. But I don't think either one of us really thought past that, and I'm always been surprised by the fact that. Roy let it go through as the editor. He saw it. I don't think he thought twice about it.
And then did Stan have any reaction after it came out and was like, hey, what did you do? Wait a minute.
Well, I think Stan didn't realize, first of all, for Stan it was just another story.
Okay.
And he had done this before. He had killed off characters before. But he'd always done it in the traditional Marvel way,
heroic death.
Yeah, the heroic death, the guy throwing himself in front of the bullet, a la, Johnny Storm's dad, Johnny MCU's dad, or, Gwen Stacy's father, saving the little kid.
Yes.
I mean, all of that stuff. And I, as a member of a more cynical generation, came along and did exactly the same story, but in a kind of I think a kind of a very dark, defeated sort of way. And in the same, the natural descendant of this story is the Dark Knight. The Dark Knight film, in which Batman rushes to go rescue the woman that he loves and goes to the wrong place. That's not something that would ever have been done in the comics, and probably still to this day would never be done in the comics, where Batman fails like that. Now, he, you could say, wasn't culpable for the failure because he didn't, he thought he was going to rescue her. But, you could also say that he didn't think it through, that he didn't realize that if the Joker was implying that she was at place X, that she was probably then at place Y, because that would be the joke, right?
Absolutely.
You know, and you could say that he was culpable in that sense.
And what about the Sam Raimi film, the first film? I mean, you know, what goes through your mind as someone who wrote that story, and see it play out on the screen, but of course see it play out where the hero is successful and stuff? What were your thoughts as you were watching
Well,
it?
I understood totally. I mean, I wouldn't have done that story as an issue of, I mean, as the first Spider-Man story. I mean, what a bummer that would have been. You know, bad enough.
Definitely.
He's semi-responsible for his uncle's death. To then have him, you know, be directly responsible or implicated in the death of his girlfriend, that would have been, you know, what kill us now.
Oh no, I agree with
that. And
that.
also, it's a different media. You know,
Sure.
Superhero movies are not for, with the exception of movies like Dark Knight and Watchmen, are not for adults.
Sure.
Or haven't been for adults. So, you know, a story that's supposed to appeal to 13-year-olds. This is why it was so bizarre that we did this story in the comics, you know, as we did. 'Cause at that time, we were still thinking of our audience as 13-year-olds.
Well, and I think I was 9 at the time. Was it 73? What year was this that you did this? Or 71?
73, I think. Yeah,
Okay, 73. Yeah, I mean, I was 9. And I mean, and as a 9-year-old, it didn't scar me, but if anything, it blew my mind. And what do you think of the whole... I mean, you know, unfortunately, I'm a living example of this as someone in my 40s still reading comics. I can say that you're in the boat with me because...
Sure.
But yeah, what do you think of the medium kind of growing up with its readers and now trying to entertain this adult audience as well?
Well, I think it's fine. You know, I mean, I think that it's another mythology that is useful for telling stories with. I was thinking about the fact that, you know, the baby boomer generation is we will never let go. You know, of our childhood toys. I mean, look at it. We're still listening to the same music that we were listening to, and we've had such an impact on the world that there has been really no progression outside of, you know, if you take rap music as a progression, but there's been no progression in rock since 1967.
You're right.
You know, it's the same. You know, it's a little faster tempo, you know, but that's basically it. You know, a Coldplay song could play in 1967, and it would be the same. You know, the audience would say, "Oh yeah, that's good," you know.
Sure.
And that's not, and I'm fine with that, you know. But I'm stunned by it at the same time because that's 40 years later. Go back 40 years before 1967, and you're talking about an entirely different kind of music.
Absolutely.
You know, 1927, you're talking about something that would be incomprehensible in 67. How is it that the music of 2009 could be listened to by somebody in 1967 and be recognizable? It's a real statement about how this generation, you know, the baby boomer generation, dominates. And one of those things we're dominating with is our interest in comics. You know, the comics that we read when we were kids, we are now making into movies.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, Sam Raimi is not quite I don't know if he's a boomer or not, but he read my stuff when he was a kid. That's the stuff that was his touchstone.
Absolutely.
And so that's what he's interested in telling. That's the kind of stories he's interested in telling.
Wow. What'd you think of Watchmen, the film?
I think I loved it, to be honest. To me, it's Watchmen is to superhero movies what the Wild Bunch was to westerns.
I like that. That could fly, absolutely.
You know, you can go on and continue to make westerns after the Wild Bunch, but really the mythology is dead. You know, I mean, it's you have to basically ignore the movie in order to go on and make other movies, and that's what happened with the Wild Bunch. You know, the Wild Bunch summed up an entire mythological structure and tied it up in a nice neat knot and put a stake through it. And in my mind, that's sort of what Watchmen has done. I was heartbroken by that film. I mean, I loved the comic book, but I tell you that the comic book didn't leave me feeling as sad as the movie did.
That's really interesting.
Yeah, you know, I mean, when Rorschach dies at the end of that film, you know, I was heartbroken. You know, I mean, and who would have thought? You know, here you have this character who's an unrelenting madman, and by the end of the movie, you're on his side.
Yeah,
that's an accomplishment. And it's the same thing that happens in Wild Bunch, you know, where you see these guys who are reprehensible human beings. You know, I mean, the first thing that I think William Holden says, you know, is if they move, kill them. You know, and he's talking about these people, you know, they're just ordinary people, and then they go out in the middle of the street and they're just killing everybody around them.
Oh yeah.
And by the end of the movie, when those guys go walking down, you know, into their deaths, you know, you're feeling like, oh my God, you know, I feel sad for these folks. You know, there's something lost here, and I think that's what was accomplished with Watchmen. I think the fact that the movie wasn't a hit is not surprising to me. I don't know why on God's earth anyone would have financed that film. Seriously,
I understand what you're saying. Absolutely,
I'm very glad they did, but they must have been drinking something, you know, or smoking something to think that there was going to be an audience for it. Any more than there would have been an audience for Wild Bunch. I mean, it's surprising that Wild Bunch did find an audience. But if you look at the original critical reaction to Wild Bunch, it was just mercilessly hammered by everybody except, I think, Pauline Kael.
Well, maybe Watchmen too. Then will because it seems like the fanboy, the overwhelming negative response to it it was too on the nose, and that to me always strikes me as odd in terms of that's a negative thing. It's like, well, you know, and also that I think Zack Snyder played to that same baby boomer memory of. I know a big complaint was that the songs were too on, like Sounds of Silence during the funeral, or even Flight of the Valkyries during the Vietnam scenes and stuff. You know, exactly, and that's the kind of reaction I had. I laughed, too, and in appreciation of that, in terms of course these things fit. Of course you're going to use these songs
Absolutely.
At those moments. So, yeah, maybe time will maybe time will be kinder to it from a fan standpoint than, like you say, what the critics initially thought of it.
Yeah, I do think that it's going to. I think it's going to be a rediscovered movie. I mean, maybe when the director's cut comes out on DVD, you know, people will have a better sense of what it was that he accomplished. But it's in my mind. I mean, I thought it was the best movie of the year, and I still do. You know, I mean, and I like a lot of the movies that have come out this year. So I'm not, you know, saying there's a bunch of stinkers out there, but it's a movie that I've seen now. I saw it 3 times, and I've only seen Dark Knight once. And the reason and I like Dark Knight quite a bit.
Me too.
But I didn't want to go back and re-experience Dark Knight. Although I fully intend to at some point. But with Watchmen, I wanted to go back and re-immerse myself in that world and re-engage with those characters. And those characters, I think, were far more empathetic than they were in the comic. And that's without changing anything about them. You know, I don't think that Schneider did anything different with the characters than Alan Moore had done. Just that he made them, I think, more empathetic just by the fact that we could see the pain that they were experiencing, you know, physically. I mean, Moore constantly talks about how you can't do his comic books as films because of the difference in the medium, you know, the media. Mm-hmm. That comics, you know, you can break a scene down and see fractions of a moment, you know, in slivers of time, and that's absolutely true. But there's also, you know, an upside to that, which is that when you see the film version of something, if it's done well, as I think that Watchmen was done, you get to see things that you couldn't see in the comic book. You know, you get to see the pain in the character's eyes in a way that you couldn't see in a comic book that's frozen in time. And I think, you know, Moore is both correct and wrong. You know, and that's fine too. You know, because he's an icon. You know, and somebody I admire tremendously. But he's not a filmmaker, nor should he be. And you know, he doesn't see what the language of films brings to things that is not available to him as a comic book writer.
You've been patient with me, and I know I'm keeping you from your dinner, so I just want to ask you in closing, with all that in mind, would you want to write a comic book script and try and do a film? I know you did Fire and Ice, and I hope we have a future conversation where we can talk about that and Firestorm and some of the things that we haven't talked about. That's the great thing about your career, Gerry. I mean, there are so many things to cover, but you know, to leave it on this.
And I'm a talker too. So.
No, and that's no. And I, honestly, man, I really appreciate it. I know my listeners will too, because. You know, really, it's a pleasure to be able to talk to you, and I know a lot of people want to know what you think, and you know, appreciate your time in the business and your insight in what you see. So would you want to do that? Would you want to write a comic book film script?
Not actually. I don't really want to work in film and television again. So it's not even that I wouldn't want to write a comic book. Although I find myself going, oh, that'd make a cool scene. But the compromises of working in film are such that. Anything that I would do there wouldn't really be mine anyway.
Okay.
You know, by the time it's done, that's a younger guy's medium too. You know, I mean, that's for people who have got the patience and the stamina and the energy and the passion to put up with the crap, you know, that you have to put up with.
John Schulian told me the same thing. The writer, I don't know if you worked with him or not on Hercules, but
which?
John Schulian.
Oh, yeah, I think I met him.
Okay. Well, I know he had told me the same thing, that, yeah, when he was done with television, he was kind of done.
It's a quote from somebody, you know, that I don't remember the context of it, but just, you know, I'm too old and you know, and too rich. I'm not rich, but, you know, I'm too old, certainly, you know, and I don't need to do it the way that I needed to do it back then. And it's that need that gets you through the pain of the compromises, you know, because you're constantly saying to yourself, "This is going to be better." You know, the next iteration of this will be better. You know, once I get past this, then it'll be fine. You know, and you're still so caught up and passionate that you believe that that's going to happen. Well, it isn't. You know, and that's what experience and time brings you to. Is that you start saying, "Well, you know, if I haven't done it by this point, I'm probably not going to." That's not to say it can't be done. You know, I think, like, for example, I worked with Bob and Alex Kurtzman and Bob Orsi on Hercules also, and those guys are enormously talented and passionate, and they're getting to make the movies that they wanted to make.
They wrote Star Trek, correct?
Yeah, Star Trek, Transformers, you know, The Island. You know, they're the guys of summer. You know, the boys of summer.
Absolutely.
And they know how to do it, and they've got the passion and the fire to make it happen. And I can't wait to see what they're doing next.
There you go.
They've got it.
Well, I will ask then if we could, maybe a few months from now, maybe as Animal Man is wrapping up, if we could check in again.
Sure.
That would be wonderful. And I like I said, there's so much that we haven't talked about. I know there are Firestorm fans that are tearing their hair out that we didn't have a chance to talk about Ronnie Raymond.
Well, you know, as I say, I'm a talker, so anytime.
What a pleasure to have a chance to talk with Gerry Conway. I've been following that guy since I was a kid, and it's great to see that he's still writing great stories. The Last Days of Animal Man, issue 2 came out last Wednesday. It's on the stands from DC Comics, a 6-issue miniseries. And look for some of Gerry's classic runs from Marvel and DC, also collected by the respective publishers. And we'll be talking to Gerry in a few months and catch up more because, as I said, so much of his career yet to go through, and would love the opportunity to talk more with Gerry Conway. This episode of Word Balloon is brought to you by tomorrow's publication, the Comic Book Podcast Companion. Comic book podcasts have taken the internet by storm, and Tomorrow's is offering you the chance to get behind the scenes of 10 of today's top comic book podcasts. You'll be hearing interviews with the cast of Around Comics, Quiet Panelologists at Work, the Comic Book Queers, iFanboy, the Crankcast, Collected Comics Library, Tomorrow's Own Tune-In Podcast, the Pipeline Podcast, Comic Geek Speak, and me, John Sunches from Word Balloon. How about that? It's a great book. It also features interviews with Gene Colan, Tim Seeley, and Matt Fraction, and art by those three guys as well, including Mike Norton art as well. You'll find all that in there, and a great cover from Mike Manley. It retails for $15.95. If you order it from their website, tomorrows.com, you can get it for $13.56 and save 15% off the cover price. There's a digital edition of the book also available for $9.95. Just go to their website, tomorrows.com, TWOMORROWS.com. The comic book podcast companion written by Eric Houston from Tomorrow's Publishing. That'll do it for this edition of Word Balloon. Thanks for listening. John Suntress reminding you that Word Balloon is all over the internet. Come to our website, wordballoon.com. We've got an archive of well over 200 interviews with comic creators like Gerry Conway, but also you can find us at iTunes if you search under Word Balloon. If you're at iTunes, feel free to leave us a review and a rating. That would be terrific. And if you have any questions or comments about the show, come to the Word Balloon Forum, which is at wordballoon.com and also available at jinxworld.com. Or you can email me, john@wordballoon.com. Until next time, Word Balloon is a copyright feature of Shaky Productions, copyright 2009.